In the summer of 1969, 7-year-old Lucas Barnett stepped out of the small house on Barnett Street to walk to the corner store. 10 minutes later, a neighbor saw him turn onto the road leading to the main street, and then he vanished. No screams, no physical traces, no consistent witnesses. Search teams scoured every vacant lot, every park, every stretch of railroad tracks. Newark police concluded that he could not have gone farther than a few blocks, but there was no body, no discarded clothing, and no sign at all that he was still in the neighborhood. The family was told that Lucas might have been taken out of New Jersey, or worse, never to be found again. Rumors in the community spoke of a strange man who had once lived near the area. For 56 years, the name Lucas Barnett lingered as an unsolved mystery, until an elderly man in Atlantic Highlands applied for new paperwork, and the entire case began to move in a direction no one could have expected. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Newark, New Jersey. One summer afternoon stretched out warm under a thin haze of heat rising from the concrete pavement. Barnett Street lay quiet beneath the thick canopy of green trees, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze and casting dappled patches of shade across the sidewalks. That little neighborhood carried the familiar calm of old red brick row houses, where everyone knew each other's faces, and kids often gathered on front steps to play simple games that still filled the whole block with noise. The sounds of children laughing mixed with the thump of a ball against cement, and in the distance came the steady rumble of streetcars on the tracks, like a familiar heartbeat of the city. On that afternoon, no one imagined anything unusual was about to happen, because everything moved slowly, ordinarily, and peacefully. Lucas Barnett, the 7-year-old boy with bright eyes and a quick, light run, stepped out of the house with the same carefree look he always had. He told his mother he wanted to go to the corner store to buy something, maybe a candy bar or an ice cream cone. The kind of thing kids in this neighborhood often begged pocket change for on summer afternoons. Lucas wore a bright-colored shirt that stood out against the reddish-brown of the brick walls and the pale gray of the cement, turning his small figure into a clear, vivid spot on the empty street. He walked along the sidewalk, lightly kicking a pebble, his arms swinging with each step, nothing at all suggesting this was anything other than an ordinary moment. When Lucas reached the intersection of Barnett Street and Maple Avenue, a neighbor happened to be standing at the window, gently pulling back the curtain to let in the breeze, and caught sight of the boy turning onto the small road leading to the main part of town. The scene lasted only a few seconds, enough to register in memory as just another fleeting image of everyday life. A 7-year-old boy doing something completely routine. But later, that moment became the final detail, the most important marker anyone ever had of seeing Lucas. The afternoon faded into dusk, the golden light slowly dying behind the rooftops, the hot daytime breezes turning cooler. Kids in the neighborhood started heading home as parents' calls echoed from wooden porches. But Lucas did not return. At first, his mother thought maybe he had gotten caught up playing or held up by some friends. She stood on the front steps looking down the road he had taken, waiting for a familiar figure to appear. But there was nothing. Then the waiting turned to worry, and the worry turned to a growing sense of dread. Lucas's mother hurried to one neighbor's house, then another, asking everyone if they had happened to see the boy coming back. A few adults in the neighborhood walked the small road together, calling Lucas's name, peering into dark corners and backyards, where kids often hid during games. But everything was empty. The road he had turned onto remained as silent as always, leaving no hint of what had happened. When the sky went completely dark, the yellow porch lights came on, and in the tension that spread with every breath, Lucas's family decided to call the police. And from that moment, the 7-year-old boy named Lucas Barnett officially vanished from Newark. When the call from the Barnett family reached the dispatch center, the first Newark Police Department patrol cars quickly arrived in the neighborhood. The summer evening still carried lingering heat, the yellowish streetlights cast down on the silent sidewalks, and the peaceful atmosphere from the afternoon now felt stretched tight by quiet anxiety. The first 2 officers on the scene went straight to the location believed to be where Lucas was last seen, the intersection of Barnett Street and Maple Avenue, where the boy had turned onto the small road leading to the main street before disappearing from the neighbor's view. They turned on their flashlights, swept along the length of the road, but drew no immediate conclusions. The first step in procedure was to identify the closest witness. The woman living in the house with the window overlooking the small road, the one who had seen Lucas turn onto it late in the afternoon, became the first witness interviewed. She described Lucas walking alone, with nothing unusual about him, no adult nearby. She recalled that the boy was walking hurriedly but not running, and that was all. No cries, no strange noises, no sign that anything wrong had happened. But that statement, though the first and most important, did not help police pinpoint Lucas's next direction clearly. Other witnesses in the area, questioned as officers went door to door through the night, provided inconsistent descriptions. One person said they thought they had seen Lucas heading toward the store near the corner. Another insisted the boy seemed to be going toward the park, while a man standing on his porch said he saw a child's figure run past in the opposite direction. From both of those accounts, the scattered pieces of information did not form any continuous path, causing the officers to realize almost immediately that this was not a simple child missing case confined to a few blocks. When gathering all the statements collected in the first 45 minutes, the investigation team saw three possible directions Lucas might have taken: toward the grocery store, toward Weequahic Park, or along Maple Avenue leading to the main part of town. There were no surveillance cameras in Newark in 1969 to provide additional information, forcing police to rely entirely on what residents offered, and the vagueness in the statements made every direction equally possible. A map of the boy's route was sketched right there at the temporary command center set up on the hood of a patrol car. Under flashlight beams, 3 arrows were drawn on the neighborhood map, representing the 3 directions Lucas might have continued in. Between those 3 directions lay an overlapping section, a narrow stretch of road between 2 streets that no witness had reported seeing Lucas pass through. It was an information gap. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, no one provided any data at all. And right in that gap, the small narrow area covered by tree shadows and silent houses, the investigation team recognized the first key point. This was very likely where Lucas disappeared, not because there was any specific sign of danger, but because there was absolutely no sign at all. The complete absence of witnesses in a densely populated residential area was unusual. The team immediately marked this stretch of road as the probability disappearance zone, a term used for cases where witness data breaks off in a way that's hard to explain. It did not reveal what happened, but it did reveal what did not happen. Lucas did not complete any of the other 3 directions, or at least no one saw him do so. The zone was quiet enough for a child to vanish without making a sound, close enough to home that no one would notice, and just out of sight of the witnesses so that no one detected the slightest change. In the technology and data-limited conditions of 1969, identifying such a point right from the first night was an important step forward. It was not evidence, but it was the first foundational structure of the investigation. And as the officers looked at the map, the circled mark on that stretch of road began to become the focal point, the center around which every line of their reasoning would revolve in the hours and days to come. When the neighborhood map had been marked with the 3 possible directions and the disappearance gap had been identified, the investigation team immediately got to work, dissecting every statement collected that night. In any missing person case, especially involving a young child, witness statements are often the single most important source of information. But in this case, what the residents provided was like mismatched puzzle pieces, each one pulling the story in a different direction. The first witness was the woman who had seen Lucas last, from her own window. She stated that the boy turned onto the small road leading to the main part of town. This was the clearest statement, and the reason police chose that location as the initial reference point. However, she did not see anyone near Lucas, did not see any vehicle stop, and did not hear any unusual sounds. This statement established the starting point, but did not establish the next direction. The second witness, a middle-aged man living 2 blocks away, said he thought he saw Lucas heading toward the grocery store at the corner, but when pressed further, he admitted he did not remember the exact time. He was not sure it was Lucas or just some other kid in the area. This detail caused his statement to be flagged as not sufficiently supportive. The third witness, a 10-year-old boy living near the park, said he saw Lucas going toward Weequahic Park. However, the boy could not remember what Lucas was wearing, nor could he describe his walk or any other features beyond it was a little kid. In missing child investigations, statements from children are always recorded, but must be scrutinized closely, because children's memories are easily influenced by circumstances and assumptions. This statement, though entered into the record, was not strong enough to guide the investigation. The fourth witness, an elderly man sitting on his front porch, provided a different detail. He claimed that afternoon, he saw an adult standing next to a child who looked like Lucas, but when questioned closely, he could not remember whether it was really Lucas or not. He could not describe what the adult was wearing, how tall or short, hair color, or even confirm whether they interacted or were just coincidentally in the same area. When the team checked his vantage point relative to the route Lucas took, they found his view was obstructed by two large oak trees and a parked car in front of the house, making his statement even harder to verify. The fifth witness, a woman walking her dog that afternoon, said she saw a child running across the street in the opposite direction from the previous statements, heading toward Maple Avenue. However, when asked for identifying details, she only remembered that the child was wearing a bright-colored shirt, which was too vague to prove it was Lucas. The sixth witness, a plumber working at a house near the neighborhood, stated that he did not see Lucas but remembered hearing the sound of a child's feet running past quickly. However, the time frame he recalled did not match the other statements. The investigation team collected all 6 statements and placed them side by side for cross-checking. The stories were too disjointed. One direction toward the store, one toward the park, one toward Maple Avenue, one statement about an unidentified adult appearing, and 2 unverifiable statements. When comparing the relative times each witness recalled, police discovered significant discrepancies. Each person gave a time marker that did not align with the others. Some said, while it was still sunny. Others said when it was nearly dark, making the window of time when Lucas appeared at each location impossible to pin down. Additionally, each witness's vantage point was at different corners of the neighborhood, so their observations could not rule one another out but also could not support one another. Police tried to reconstruct a timeline based on these statements, but every effort led to the same conclusion. No path could be confirmed. No statement was strong enough to serve as the centerpiece of the investigation, and no statement directly contradicted the others in a way that could be eliminated through normal logic. All were vague, lacking specificity, and did not lead police to any particular location or person. In the internal report written that very night, the on-duty investigator noted a brief but telling remark: all statements are vague and non-actionable. Those statements created the impression that Lucas had been seen in multiple places, but in reality, they pointed to nowhere at all. The investigating officers realized that without physical evidence or more direct witnesses, every lead pointed back to one dark spot: the disappearance gap between the 2 streets, where no statement could fill the void. And that was exactly where the investigation would have to focus in the steps ahead. 3 investigative directions were established right that night. Not as separate choices, but as 3 parallel lines of reasoning that had to be analyzed simultaneously, because any misstep in the early stage could send the entire case off track later. What the investigation team had in hand at that moment was only one confirmed last sighting point for Lucas and a witness gap. From those 2 elements, they began building 3 scenarios: the boy being directly approached, being taken away by vehicle, or wandering off on his own and disappearing in a place no one saw. No scenario was considered more prominent, because all were possible in a residential area with as many hidden corners as Barnett Street. The first scenario, contact abduction, was examined based on the possibility that an adult approached Lucas right on the small road. This was not a random guess, but grounded in the reality that children tend to stop when an adult calls their name or offers something, even if they do not know the person. Young children often respond with curiosity before responding with caution. The team considered whether the sudden appearance of an adult could have been enough to make Lucas change direction in an instant. They analyzed the road structure: narrow pavement, wide tree canopies, many house doors set slightly back, creating shadowed areas where someone could stand without being noticed. One small detail in a statement that there was an adult standing next to a child was viewed by investigators as a potential sign of interaction. But because that statement lacked identifying features, had no confirmed time, and was only glimpsed briefly, it could not be concluded that the child was actually Lucas, nor could it be treated as solid evidence. Nevertheless, contact abduction remained a logical scenario, especially in an environment with many crossed sight lines, obstructed by trees and parked cars. The second scenario, non-contact abduction, focused on the hypothesis that Lucas was taken by vehicle in such a short time that no witness noticed. This required a different analysis. Could a car approach the area without drawing attention? They examined the traffic layout of the road leading to the main street. Narrow but wide enough for a vehicle to stop for a few seconds. Intersections without convex mirrors. Many privately parked cars, creating visual barriers, and small curves between houses that made it hard for pedestrians to see the full stretch. Even a single car backing into a shadowed spot under trees could be enough for many witnesses to miss its arrival or departure. In the half-light of late afternoon turning to dusk, a vehicle could approach, stop, and leave without leaving clear signs. This was one of the reasons non-contact abduction was kept as a serious scenario, even though at that point the officers had no physical evidence or descriptions related to any vehicle. The third scenario, wander-off scenario, was considered because of the age factor. A 7-year-old could easily be drawn to something along the way, change his mind, and head in a new direction without anyone noticing. However, when reviewing the statements, no witness described Lucas running quickly, looking confused, or showing unusual behavior. Most said he was walking normally, not hurried, not scared. This did not rule out the possibility that he turned on his own, but it made this scenario weaker than the other two. Still, the team kept it on the list, because a child wandering into a dead-end alley, backyard, or low-traffic area, and then suffering an accident or being approached by a stranger remained plausible. Once the three scenarios were built, the next step was to test them against logical data. First, they evaluated spatial feasibility. Each scenario had to be checked against the actual conditions of the neighborhood. Contact abduction fit the dark stretches near the turn. Non-contact abduction fit the blind spots created by parked cars and large trees, and wander-off scenario fit the side paths leading to less traveled areas. All three scenarios passed the first test. None were eliminated by terrain factors. The second test was the timeline. Though there was no exact minute-by-minute account, the team used the relative time windows witnesses recalled to estimate how many minutes Lucas might have had to travel, how far before his parents realized he had not returned. The result showed that any of the scenarios could have occurred within that window. This made prioritizing one direction impossible. No direction contradicted the statements, and none was strengthened more than the others by the time data. The third test was the degree of match with previous missing child cases in the area. Contact abduction cases often had witnesses seeing a child stop or interact. Here, that sign existed but was too faint. Non-contact abduction cases often involved noise or vehicle lights, but the area at that time was noisy enough and had enough parked cars that such signs would be hard to notice. Wander-off scenario cases usually showed signs of a lost child, but Lucas was not described that way. When the initial evaluation ended, all three directions remained intact. Each was reasonable, but equally lacking in evidence. This pushed the investigation into a phase requiring new data, and right there, the next pieces of information would begin to reveal a more complex structure to this disappearance. Establishing the three scenarios was only the starting step. To determine which scenario was more likely, the investigation team needed an accurate spatial foundation, a diagram of Lucas's movement route in the final minutes he was last seen. The neighborhood map of Newark from 1969 was brought out, the kind of pale yellow grid paper map that police units commonly used back then. The small roads, interspersed lawns, dead-end alleys, and side paths were all marked with thin lines, some spots even yellowed with age. On the map, the reference point where the witness saw Lucas turn onto the road leading to the main street was marked with a small circle. From that point, the officers began reconstructing the boy's possible routes. What made this case particularly difficult was the absence of any surveillance cameras. In the 1960s, Civilian camera systems were virtually non-existent in residential areas, and commercial cameras only appeared in places like banks or large warehouses. That meant every analysis had to rely on the map, residents' observational capabilities, and the actual terrain. When overlaying the statements onto the map, a spatial structure began to emerge. There were 3 branching directions from the point Lucas was last seen, and all 3 had sections obscured by buildings or tree canopies. These sections were marked in red ink and quickly identified as blind corners, hidden vantage points where any event could occur without being detected by anyone. The first blind corner was right at the street corner, where 2 buildings formed a narrow gap. No house had a window facing into it, and the minimal width of that section severely limited visibility. The moment Lucas turned into it, he would immediately be out of the neighbor's sight. The second blind corner was near a vacant lot, where a frequently parked vehicle blocked the entire sidewalk section. This spot was wide enough for a vehicle to stop briefly without drawing attention, and private enough for an adult to stand waiting without being spotted from surrounding windows. The third blind corner was a gentle downhill stretch leading to a side alley, where overhanging tree canopies created large shadows. Children often passed through here, but adults rarely paid attention, making this area a natural dark spot in the neighborhood structure. Once the 3 blind corners were marked, the investigation team began analyzing the likelihood of Lucas reaching each location before disappearing. One notable point was that each blind corner lay within a short walking distance, fitting the time frame between when the witness saw Lucas and when his mother realized he had not returned. This helped confirm that any of the scenarios could have taken place at one of these 3 spots. To further the analysis, the team had to consider pedestrian traffic density in each section. A quick map of residents' daily habits was compiled from interviews. The stretch near Barnett Street was usually busy in the afternoon but thinned out toward evening. The path toward the park often had children before dinner time but few adults. The stretch leading to the main street was busier with more shops around, making it less likely that no witness saw Lucas. When analyzing this layer of data, one detail stood out. The direction toward the park and the direction toward the side alley were the 2 areas with the lowest adult traffic density and the poorest visibility. This made those 2 directions more likely for an incident to occur without anyone noticing compared to the main street direction. Although nothing could be confirmed yet, the team began leaning toward the possibility that Lucas did not continue toward the grocery store because that route had 3 households with windows overlooking the street, and none of them saw Lucas proceed further. Another analysis was added: the distance from the point Lucas was last seen to the 2 nearest highways, Route 22 and I-78. Both highways were only a few minutes' drive away. The team noted that if a vehicle reached one of the 3 blind corners, the time to escape the neighborhood and merge onto one of those highways would be very quick. If a vehicle entered, stopped for a few seconds, took Lucas, and left the area, it could entirely happen within the window where no witness noticed anything unusual. The fact that Route 22 connected directly to multiple interstate routes, along with I-78 leading into Pennsylvania, made the possibility of Lucas being taken out of New Jersey something that had to be treated as a serious scenario. The phrase cross-state abduction appeared for the first time in the team's internal notes that night. With 3 blind corners, low traffic density in 2 of the 3 directions, and proximity to major highways, the overall picture began to take shape. A child could vanish from this neighborhood in a much shorter time than initially imagined. But to determine which scenario the disappearance fell into, the investigation team needed more data. And that forced them to expand the scope of analysis, not just within the neighborhood, but into possible routes that could have taken Lucas out of Newark that very afternoon. The next steps, therefore, had to extend beyond the block, into areas likely connected to major roadways. And that was the direction the investigation would continue to pursue. Once the movement route map had been outlined with the 3 blind corners and the potential connections to major highways, the investigation team moved to the next step, evaluating the entire surrounding infrastructure in the area where Lucas disappeared to identify high-risk spots where a child could be taken without anyone noticing. Newark, in 1969, was not a modern city with clear planning. Residential areas were interspersed with old structures, abandoned vacant lots, poorly maintained side alleys, and many transitional zones between residential and light industrial areas. When overlaying the infrastructure map onto Lucas's possible movement routes, 6 risk points immediately emerged and were marked for analysis. The first area was Weequahic Park, just a few blocks from the disappearance location. The park was large, with many small trails, thick trees, and especially numerous sections hidden from view of the main roads. Children frequently passed through here, but in the late afternoon, the number of adults gradually decreased. Surveying officers noted at least 4 side paths leading into the park from the small roads around Barnett Street. These side paths were completely unobservable if an adult was waiting or a vehicle stopped there. However, during the quick flashlight sweep on the first night, they found no signs that Lucas had passed through this area. This did not rule out the park, but it also provided no clear leads. The second area was a vacant lot between 2 rows of old houses, where a construction project had once existed but had been abandoned for years. In the mid-60s and 70s, such vacant lots were quite common in Newark due to stalled urban redevelopment projects. A vacant lot wide enough for someone to hide under tree shadows or behind leftover building materials. Investigators noted that this area lay right between the first blind corner and a side road leading to the main street, making it a convenient position for someone to approach or wait in advance. But during the on-site check, they found no footprints, drag marks, or any signs of disturbance. The lot remained a risk point, but without supporting evidence. The third point was an old workshop east of Barnett Street, formerly a mechanical repair shop that had closed in the early 60s. The abandoned building formed a large structural block obscuring views from 3 directions. Old industrial sites like this often had multiple uncontrolled entrances, iron gates left open or loosely locked. If Lucas passed by or was led in here, no one in the surrounding houses could see. Similar to the previous 2 points, the workshop was checked, but no objects or traces related to him were found. Still, due to the high visual obstruction and proximity to the second blind corner, it continued to be kept on the risk point list. The fourth point was the old railroad tracks running behind Maple Avenue. Though no longer in regular use, the tracks remained, and this area was a place children sometimes used as a shortcut to other neighborhoods. The tracks cut across a wide, deep stretch of land that, having been neglected, had become a low-traffic zone. A pedestrian or small child could disappear from sight in seconds by stepping down into the track area. The investigation team noted this as a location likely tied to the wander-off scenario, but also possibly where a vehicle could stop quickly and then leave via a side path along the tracks. Once again, no physical evidence, but the risk level was rated high. The fifth point was the informal service shop, small stores or stalls repairing watches, bicycles, or household cleaning that often opened irregularly with no fixed hours. Shops like this were scattered around the Barnett Street area, each with a back door or side entrance leading to an alley. A child passing by could be pulled in without notice, especially shops in less populated sections. Officers noted 3 such shops within close radius of the disappearance area. Though no unusual signs inside, the entrance-exit structure kept these shops in the risk group. The final point was an unregistered parking lot behind an old commercial building. This parking lot was not tightly managed, had no barriers, and was where many vehicles parked informally. From the lot, a side path led directly to the small road Lucas was seen turning onto. A vehicle entering or leaving this area without drawing residents' attention was entirely possible. The investigation team confirmed this as the highest risk point among the 6 because it connected directly to the third blind corner. When compiling data from all 6 points, an unexpected issue arose. In the initial search map drawn hastily in the first hours, there was a small road segment completely unmarked. This was a side road behind the old workshop, connecting straight to the unregistered parking lot, and from there leading to a route that could quickly reach Route 22. The fact that this road was overlooked startled the investigation team. No one could be certain whether Lucas or any vehicle had used it, but the existence of this road opened a significant gap. From the disappearance spot, just a few steps could access an escape route entirely outside witnesses' observation. This discovery forced the team to expand the evaluation scope and reconsider all hypotheses about Lucas's direction of movement. The overlooked road segment, a small gap on the map, now became a critical point, requiring deeper investigation in the steps ahead. After marking the 6 risk areas and discovering the overlooked road segment on the search map, the investigation team moved to the next essential step, identifying everyone present in the neighborhood at the time Lucas disappeared. They requested the Newark Administrative Department to provide a list of residents living within a 5-block radius of Barnett Street during the 1968 to 1969 period. This was a complicated process because the area had high resident turnover, with many families moving in and out constantly, and not everyone fully registered their residency. The investigators spent hours cross-referencing residency records, address registries, local tax lists, and even utility service records to determine who actually lived in the area at that time. Once the basic list was complete, they marked each household: families, young couples, elderly people living alone, short-term room renters, and especially men living alone or without clear family ties. From over 70 individuals recorded, the team narrowed it down to 18 men who could have been present during the time frame when Lucas walked through the neighborhood. From this list, they continued eliminating based on factors: unsuitable age, limited health, jobs requiring them to be elsewhere that day, or proven alibis. Those remaining after screening were placed in the possible involvement group, a list used for deeper review in later steps. After more than 3 hours of work, the list shrank to just 4 names: 4 men with vague information, unstable residency records, or unexplained gaps in administrative documents. 3 of them lived only 2 to 3 blocks from where Lucas disappeared, but none of the 4 was described by neighbors as familiar or having community ties. This made them the focus of the cross-checking process. The first case was a man in his early 40s, a seasonal laborer living in a rented room in an old brick building. Records showed he had moved to Newark only 6 months before Lucas's disappearance, but left right after the summer of 1969. When police contacted the former landlord, the landlord said he left quite suddenly, without leaving a message or forwarding address. This was enough to place the man in the risk group, but at that time there was no direct evidence linking him to Lucas's disappearance. The second case was a plumbing repair worker who had rented a room in the area, but he had no tax records, no long-term address registration, and not even anyone who remembered his face. According to city records, he left Newark right around the time Lucas vanished. The timing of his departure made him flagged for further review, but police could not yet determine whether he was a transient type or had some other reason to disappear from the area so quickly. The third case was a man who had worked for an informal repair shop near Maple Avenue. He appeared in temporary registration logs, but there was no other personal information. When police asked the shop owner, the owner only remembered that he was quite quiet and came and went without much interaction. However, the owner said he left Newark about a month before Lucas disappeared. The timing mismatch made involvement unlikely, but the vagueness of the information kept him on as a reference of hope. The fourth case was the most noteworthy name: Walter Green. This was the first time his name surfaced during the sweep. Green had no fixed residency record, no rental registration, and no tax entries in the district. The only address linked to him was a temporary rented room in a house near the edge of the neighborhood, noted only in a portion of local police files. From the data the team gathered, Green had briefly appeared in the area in 1968 to 1969, but no one remembered his face. The former landlord also could not provide much information, only recalling that he wasn't local and didn't talk to anyone. What made Green stand out more was that he vanished from Newark records at the same time 2 other men suddenly left the city. 3 near-simultaneous disappearances, Green being one of them, led the investigation team to mark him in the file with a special notation for deeper review later. When compiling all 4 cases, the team noted that only 2 men left Newark during the exact period Lucas disappeared, and this made them the primary focus for additional investigation. The overlaps between leaving the area, lacking residency records, and having no witnesses who remembered their faces gave those 2 a higher suspicion level than the others. But Green, though not deeply analyzed at this stage, had certain details that got him mentioned in the minutes: the vague appearance, short stay, and especially the fact that he left Newark without leaving a trace. In internal records, Green was noted as individual of interest, not a suspect, but enough to keep his name on the watch list. Although there was no direct linking evidence yet, the emergence of 4 men with vague records right in the area where Lucas vanished opened a direction that needed continued expansion. The fact that 2 of them left Newark at the exact time further clarified that Lucas's disappearance might be connected to an individual not part of the local community. But to determine exactly, the investigation team needed new data, especially from sources not in the original map or statements, and that was the direction the investigation would pursue next. The resident screening, infrastructure analysis, and movement route reconstruction had created a complex picture, but yielded no specific leads. 3 blind corners, 6 risk areas, 4 men with vague records, all were merely reasoning structures, with no direct evidence leading to a viable investigative direction. In child disappearance cases, even a single piece of physical evidence, a scrap of fabric, a toy, or the smallest sign of disturbance, could become an information breakthrough. But in this case, the area where Lucas vanished left no physical traces whatsoever. No objects dropped on the road, no strange footprints, no witnesses seeing a suspicious vehicle, and no reports of screams or anything unusual in the relevant time frame. That left the investigative directions, however detailed, stuck at a theoretical level. Even the list of 4 suspicious men existed only as a reference list. None of them had behavior or evidence directly related to Lucas. In the files, each name came with a big question mark. But none of the question marks was strong enough to turn into a formal suspicion. The absence of physical evidence also meant no search warrants could be obtained. No samples collected. No traces compared. Every action had to be based on real information, and the actual information was almost zero. After the first week, the investigation neared a deadlock. Officers pulled from other areas gradually returned to their original units. New interviews grew sparse because there were no more witnesses to question, and those already questioned could not add new information. Monitoring the risk points around the area showed no unusual activity afterward. There were no signs that a perpetrator, if there was one, returned to the scene or engaged in related activity in the area. When reanalyzing all the collected data, the team realized that despite expanding the scope, clearly branching the 3 scenarios, and identifying risk points, the case still lacked a lead strong enough to take even one more step. In the Newark filing system of that time, disappearances without clear evidence would be shifted to passive monitoring status, inactive status. This was not completely closing the file, but it meant the case was no longer actively investigated daily. Instead, it would only be revisited when new information emerged or when similar cases in the area showed signs of connection. An internal memo clearly stated the case status submitted to the unit commander. No physical evidence, no identified suspect, no indicators leading to forensic analysis, no data to expand the investigation in any specific direction. With that assessment, the file on Lucas Barnett's disappearance was officially classified in the system as missing child, unresolved. This was a special category for cases where it could not be verified whether the child was abducted, wandered off, or met with an accident. It made no assumption about the cause, assigned no blame, and simply recorded the status. The child vanished from the area, reason unknown, with no information to determine the circumstances. In the NPD data archives, such unresolved cases often sat in storage for years, only occasionally pulled out when another case shared similar characteristics or when investigative technology advanced. And Lucas's case entered the system that way. Not closed, but with no further movement. No investigator wanted to put a case into inactive status, but by procedure, when there was no more data to exploit, it was required. The file was placed in a thick paper folder, stapled with all the maps, statements, resident lists, watch lists, and scattered notes from the early days. The folder was tied shut with a string, the case number written on the top right corner, and it was placed in the storage shelf for unsolved missing persons cases. There was no statement confirming Lucas's final direction. No testimony was considered weighty enough to expand the investigation. After weeks of effort that yielded no results, the case had to enter a static state, waiting for new information, waiting for an unusual report, or waiting for some coincidence to revive the investigation. And from that point, Lucas Barnett's disappearance entered its first frozen phase, marking the long period when the case would not advance even a single small step. The shift of the file to passive monitoring status did not mean the case was completely forgotten. In the 1970s through 1980s, as many northeastern states in the U.S. recorded cases of missing children or unidentified child remains, the Newark Investigation Agency periodically cross-checked those cases against Lucas Barnett's file. Medical record identification systems and DNA databases did not exist at that time, so every comparison process had to rely on physical characteristics, estimated height, age group, bone structure, and basic identifying factors. Whenever Pennsylvania, Delaware, or New York reported finding an unidentified child's body, Lucas's file would be pulled from storage and manually compared. Over more than a decade, at least 8 cases were reviewed. Unidentified bodies found in Delaware marshes, a body at the foot of railroad tracks near Philadelphia, another case in rural New York, and several scattered reports in northern New Jersey. Each case was compared to Lucas's 1969 description file, including height, build, birthmarks, and any physical details the family had provided. None matched. Some bodies were much younger or older than Lucas at the time of disappearance. Others showed signs of trauma. While Lucas's file had no indicators pointing to a similar situation, each time new information came in, investigators followed the same procedure. Pull comparison documents, assess age variance, analyze bone length, examine skull features. The results were always the same: exclusion. However, as the number of child disappearances in the Northeast rose year by year, one issue became clearer. A small group of cases shared patterns similar enough to draw attention. Not all, but a subset where children vanished from quiet residential areas, with no direct witnesses, no physical evidence, and no signs of struggle or violence at the scene. Particularly noteworthy were 3 cases in Pennsylvania in the early 70s. All children under 10, disappearing while walking short distances from home, similar to Lucas. Upon closer review, the Newark team noted similarities in timing structure. The child left home in the afternoon, was last seen not far from the house, and then vanished completely. These parallels led investigators to consider the possibility of a regional pattern, a disappearance pattern across states, involving one individual or type of perpetrator operating in multiple states. However, this conclusion remained speculative because there was no physical evidence connecting the cases, no DNA traces to compare, no suspect descriptions, no information about vehicles or strange individuals in the area. At that time, interstate federal coordination between investigative units was not effective, and information sharing between police departments usually only happened when a new case showed particularly strong similarities to an old one. But because Lucas's file lacked clear evidence, it did not become a strong reference point for linking to other cases. Still, Newark maintained the habit of periodically sending comparison requests to forensic agencies in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York. Whenever an unidentified child's body was found, Newark appeared on the list of units to notify. And for 15 years, the answer was always the same: no match. Some investigators hypothesized that if Lucas was truly the victim of a cross-state operator, the body might have been disposed of much farther away than the 3 neighboring states, even possibly in the Midwest or the Appalachian region. But that was just reasoning based on the case's prolonged silence. Other analyses suggested Lucas might not fall into the criminal abduction group, but rather the rare cases of children wandering out of residential areas and suffering accidents in hard-to-find places. However, no unidentified child body reports matched Lucas's description, whether within 50 or 200 miles. In an internal report from 1979, one investigator wrote, "If Lucas were still in the Northeast, a body or identification would have surfaced in the past 10 years. This assessment showed the agency gradually leaning toward the possibility that Lucas had left New Jersey in a direction they could not determine. However, without evidence, the case retained its unresolved status, and the file remained in Newark's storage, only pulled out for a new child disappearance. or when an unidentified child's body appeared in the region. Though the cross-checks yielded no results, they created an important foundation. Interstate monitoring ensured that if any trace of Lucas surfaced in Pennsylvania, Delaware, or New York, it would immediately be compared. And this regular comparison process meant Lucas's file was never removed from the list of cases requiring long-term monitoring, even as many years passed without any useful information. But the absence of a single match over nearly 2 decades raised a larger question. If not among the unidentified bodies, not in the similar missing child cases, and not appearing in any federal reports, then where had Lucas gone? That question hung in the file, and it would lead to the next investigative direction in later decades when technology and context changed, opening opportunities that the 1970s and 80s could not provide. As the late 1980s and early 1990s arrived, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began building behavioral models for child disappearances with unclear causes. This was the period when the FBI stepped up data collection from states to create cross-regional patterns, thereby determining whether individuals or groups of perpetrators were operating in repeating models. In the process of compiling hundreds of disappearance files from the 60s through the 80s, a few isolated names appearing in multiple local documents began to draw attention. And on that list, the name Walter Green appeared twice, not as a formal suspect, but as an individual present in the area at the time 2 disappearances occurred. One of the 2 reports involved the Newark suburbs. The other was in eastern Pennsylvania. What caused FBI analysts to note Green's name was not direct suspicion, but his unstable residency records and signs of frequent interstate movement. At that time, the name overlap between 2 disappearances in different areas was considered a noteworthy detail. When this list was shared back to Newark through the comparison process, the city's investigation team realized that the name Green was not entirely unfamiliar. It was one of the 4 individuals who had appeared on the list of men with vague records within a 5-block radius of Barnett Street, a list compiled right after Lucas vanished. And among those 4, Green was the only one whose period of stay overlapped with the time the boy disappeared. When rechecking Newark records from 1968 to 1969, investigators confirmed that Green appeared in rental data for only a very short time and left right after the summer of 1969. This matched the FBI's assessment that Green had left Newark suddenly, without leaving a forwarding address. These factors caused Green's name to start emerging as a point needing closer examination. The investigation team continued cross-checking with Pennsylvania residency records from the 1970s through 1980s. They discovered Green had appeared in a small town near Stroudsburg, living in a cheap rented room, then vanished from the area after just a few months. That was the exact location of the second disappearance the FBI noted his presence in. The overlap in timing, location, and scattered residency pattern made Green a noteworthy individual, though at this point there was no evidence showing he was connected to Lucas's case. However, Green's file began to thicken when a report from the Monroe County Police Department stated that a man matching Green's description had been questioned in 1972 regarding talking to children in the neighborhood. This report did not lead to charges and no criminal behavior was confirmed, but it added another element to the behavioral model the FBI was building. Green often appeared near areas with child disappearances or suspicious reports, yet left no legal traces. Based on this data, Newark flagged Green at the level of monitor upon new information, though the file continued to be limited by the reality. No physical evidence linking Green to Lucas. The fact that Green left Newark right after the disappearance was only a timing coincidence noteworthy but not enough to constitute criminal suspicion. The turning point came when Newark requested updated information on Green from Pennsylvania. The response arrived in the form of a simple record. Walter Green died in 1999 in Pennsylvania. Natural causes, age around over 60. He was buried in a local cemetery, with no relatives claiming the body. This information immediately dead-ended all investigative efforts in Green's direction. When an individual is deceased, police cannot interview them, cannot obtain new biological samples, cannot trace final movements, and cannot extract any other direct information. All that remained were vague residency records and 2 appearances on the FBI list. No physical evidence, no witnesses confirming interaction with Lucas, and no items from Green's former residences. The Newark investigator noted clearly in the report, Green remains a person of interest, but cannot be escalated to suspect status due to lack of actionable evidence. This meant Green continued to appear in the file, but could not become an active investigative direction. Some team members believed Green might simply have been a homeless man, moving frequently, coincidentally appearing near cases but uninvolved. Others felt his appearance in 2 FBI reports was too much of a coincidence. Both views existed, but without evidence to prioritize either, Lucas's file continued hanging between possibilities. With Green deceased, Newark had to close the investigative direction related to him, at least until a new technology or data source could change the situation. However, the fact that this name appeared in 2 FBI reports, and the sudden disappearance from Newark right at the time Lucas vanished, ensured Green was never removed from the file. He became a faint but persistent name in the case history, a shadow without evidence but one that could not be ignored. And though the Green direction led to a dead end, the details surrounding him would become an important part in the years to come, when identification technology and federal data systems completely changed how old cases were re-examined. As the early 2000s began, the Newark Police Department launched a major project to digitize all old files, especially those in the unresolved list. More than 3 decades had passed since the day Lucas vanished. Investigative technology had changed significantly, and authorities hoped that reanalyzing old cases with modern tools could bring a new opportunity. When the priority list was drawn up, the Lucas Barnett file was placed in the potential for data recovery group, though no one knew what could actually be found from a case lacking physical evidence from the very beginning. The old, worn folder was pulled from storage, each yellowed sheet scanned into digital copies from neighborhood maps, witness statements, resident lists, to the handwritten notes of the 1969 investigators. This was the first time the entire case was reconstructed digitally, allowing easier cross-checking of data and detection of overlooked points that paper files often made hard to spot. During the review, one detail was noted again. Lucas's shirt, the only item preserved from the family, had been sealed since 1969 in a standard preservation bag of that era. Because the case had no defined crime scene, the shirt did not play a major evidentiary role initially. But by 2003, it became the only lead that could yield biological traces if DNA technology was strong enough. Analysts proposed taking DNA samples from the shirt to confirm Lucas's biological profile, while also checking for any foreign traces that might remain. DNA analysis on pre-existing missing child cases had almost never been done, but at this stage, it was the only way to update the file into the newly established National Identification System. When the shirt was unsealed in the lab, technicians had to follow especially strict procedures. The old preservation bag was cut along standard lines, every fiber scanned under blue light to detect any material that might react. Surprisingly, besides the original fabric fibers, a few small different fibers appeared color, material, and length not matching Lucas's shirt fabric. These fibers were separated, repackaged, and recorded in the new evidence log. However, everything stopped at the preliminary detection level. In 2003, DNA analysis technology on small, brittle, or time-degraded materials was still limited. The foreign fibers did not carry enough biological traces to extract a viable sample. Moreover, those fibers could simply be environmental debris the shirt picked up during storage or from previous handling by staff, making it impossible to conclude they were related to a perpetrator. Still, their discovery was recorded in the file, because in long cold cases, any object not belonging to the original item could gain meaning later as technology advanced. A reference DNA sample from Lucas was successfully created from the shirt. This was the biggest advance of this review process. In the new database, this DNA profile would be used for checks whenever an unidentified body was found, or when an individual without verified papers needed comparison. But that was also the limit of 2003. The database system was not yet strongly developed, and the number of comparison profiles was too small. When analysts tried matching Lucas's DNA against digitized unidentified remains from Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware files, all results were negative. This aligned with the manual comparisons from the 1970s and 80s, but still brought no new direction. Some technicians suggested testing the foreign fibers with advanced organic composition or fiber structure analysis methods, but the lab budget at that time did not allow it. And more importantly, results from the fibers might not hold legal value since it could not be determined when they appeared on the shirt. The investigation team noted that the shirt could not be used to trace a perpetrator under the forensic standards of the day. Any biological material on the shirt, if present, had degraded too much to separate foreign DNA. The STR, short tandem repeat technology of the time, was still immature and required a larger DNA quantity than could be obtained from 3-decade-old fibers. Therefore, even though the testing process was fully carried out, the final conclusion brought no progress. No foreign DNA, no evidence related to another person, no basis to expand the investigation. The final 2003 report stated clearly, no new investigative information identified. Victim DNA sample updated to national database. No leads related to suspect. Nevertheless, digitizing the file created a quiet but meaningful change. From now on, the Lucas case was no longer just in Newark's storage shelf, but became part of the federal search system. This meant that any future trace from a man without papers, an unidentified body, or an individual applying for legal documents could be automatically compared to Lucas Barnett's file when the evidence folder was retied and returned to storage. No one on the 2003 investigation team knew that this update would become the crucial foundation for a major breakthrough many years later. But at that moment, the only conclusion remained unchanged. No progress, no new data, and the Lucas Barnett case continued in unresolved status, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist at the time. In 2020, more than half a century after the day Lucas Barnett vanished, the case still sat in Newark storage, waiting for a new sign from technology or from changes in the national data system. The surprise came not from a lead related to the case, but from what seemed like a routine administrative procedure at the New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission, where a middle-aged man living in the town of Atlantic Highlands applied for new identity documents. The man's application, temporarily called Mr. A, was initially processed like any other file. He stated that he had lost all his personal papers in a family incident decades earlier and wanted to obtain a new ID card, driver's license, and proof of residency. However, when the agency staff searched the basic data, the system returned no information matching the name, date of birth, social security number, or personal details Mr. A provided. Every attempt to match with New Jersey data, including residency records, tax records, medical records, and school records, came up empty. The staff moved on to cross-checking federal databases, SSA, passport verification systems, immigrant intake data. The result was still zero. There was no trace of this man in any system, even the old digitized databases from the 1980s. This raised a major issue. An individual in his 60s or 70s could not have existed for decades in the United States without any administrative record at all. No work history, no driver's license, no tax ID, no medical records, no voter registration, completely blank. This was something almost impossible for a long-term U.S. citizen. Under federal security procedures, a zero-match file, one with no matches at all, had to be sent to the Department of Homeland Security for risk assessment. In most cases, zero matches occur due to data entry errors or the applicant using incorrect information. But here, 3 consecutive checks all gave the same result. No man with the identity claimed by Mr. A existed in any system, even historical ones scanned from paper records. This was enough to trigger a deeper investigation process. DHS required Mr. A to provide additional alternative documents: work records, birth certificate, original papers, doctor notes, property deeds, or anything proving he existed before 2020. Mr. A had nothing. He said he never needed papers because he did odd jobs, moved frequently, and avoided the administrative system. But this explanation made the file even more suspicious. Most odd jobs still require some minimum form of identification, though Mr. A appeared cooperative, Every answer he gave failed to explain why he did not exist in any data system. DHS flagged the file in the identity anomaly category and forwarded the information to the New Jersey State Police, the unit with authority to investigate unusual identity cases related to state residency. When the report reached the NJSP Special Investigations Unit, the team noticed that Mr. A's claimed birth year, according to his statement, fell in the late 1960s. This led them to consider the possibility that he might be someone who had lived under a false identity, or had been a victim, or had gone missing as a child without ever being re-entered into the system. Another hypothesis was raised. Mr. A could be a long-ago illegal immigrant living off the grid, but this also did not explain the complete absence of any medical, daily life, or state data from times he might have interacted with public services, something most undocumented immigrants experience at least once. The case was flagged as requires cross-check with missing persons databases. When NJSP accessed the National NamUs database and the internal database containing old New Jersey missing persons files, they used estimated age indicators, possible disappearance timeframe, and basic identifying parameters to search for matching records. The system returned a list of several disappearances from the 60s and 70s, mostly children or teenagers, and one file was flagged as cannot be excluded. The Lucas Barnett file, missing since 1969. The new database compared multiple layers of information: estimated birth year, projected adult height, disappearance location, age variance based on bone structure. Each indicator was fed into the screening algorithm. The result did not confirm a match, but the Lucas file was marked as possible relevance. The moment Lucas's name appeared on the screen, the NJSP investigation team began reviewing the digitized content from 2003, the full file of statements, reconstructed maps, resident lists, and especially the DNA sample code stored in the national system. This was the first time in many years of silence that the Lucas file was activated by a factor not directly related to the case: an adult applying for papers with no administrative history. This made it the most noteworthy event in the file for decades. To assess accurately, NJSP requested Mr. A provide a biological sample for comparison under procedure. He agreed. A saliva sample was taken under standard protocol and sent to the state DNA lab. This was the step investigators cautiously called test viability, a foundational check to determine whether this file could connect to a long, cold missing person case. The investigators did not disclose suspicions or make any assumptions, but the comparison with the Lucas file was prioritized due to the initial filter match level. When Mr. A's DNA sample was entered into the system, the server automatically ran matches against stored profiles, including the Lucas DNA created from the shirt in 2003. The result was not yet analyzed, but this comparison marked the first turning point in half a century of the frozen case. An individual with no identity, living quietly for years, suddenly surfaced from the administrative system, and the first signs suggested he might belong to the group missing since childhood. This forced NJSP to send an official notice to the Newark Police Department. An unusual identity file has potential relevance to the Lucas Barnett disappearance, and from there, the case that had been dormant for 56 years began to move again. Right after receiving the notification from the New Jersey State Police about the no-identity file that might relate to a long, cold missing person case, the Newark Police Department formed a temporary task force to handle the situation. The first goal was to determine who the man in Atlantic Highlands, Mr. A, really was, and whether he had any connection to the Lucas Barnett disappearance. The identity verification process started with the most basic steps. Fingerprints. This is a quick comparison method to check if a person has ever been recorded by police, entered the country, had medical records, filed legal paperwork, or had any criminal history. The technical unit collected 10 print fingerprints under AFIS standards and submitted them to the federal system. The result came back after 48 hours. No records in the database. No fingerprints for Mr. A. In criminal, civil, immigration, employment, or any system stored from the 1980s onward. This was an abnormal result. A man over 60, living in New Jersey for years, with no fingerprints in any system, This was almost impossible if the person had lived a normal life, with even minimal administrative contact. The task force expanded the check to physical characteristics. The Lucas Barnett file from 1969, though simple, still recorded some details. A small scar on the left hip from a bicycle fall at age 6. A faint birthmark under the right shoulder blade. And a more distinctive feature, a slight indentation on the left ear rim, due to a congenital defect. These were the 3 basic markers that anyone searching in later years remembered, but had never had a chance to check in reality. When investigators examined Mr. A's body, they immediately noted each detail. The left hip had a scar about 2 centimeters long, faded over time. The color and location matched the description from the Barnett family medical record noted in 1968. Under the right shoulder blade, in the exact spot from the file, there was a small, oval, pale, pigmented area, and most notably, the rim of Mr. A's left ear showed a gentle curved indentation, not from injury but a congenital sign. This detail made the task force pause longer. All matched the Lucas file at a basic descriptive level. However, matching physical characteristics was not enough to conclude. Such signs could appear in many people, those born in the same era, same medical region, or simply by chance. Still, the fact that all 3 rare details matched made the file more serious than ever. The investigators continued comparing other factors. The 1969 file noted that Lucas was right-handed, but often held objects with his left hand when stressed, a trait recorded by his mother in her statement. When asked to write, Mr. A used his right hand, but when unexpectedly asked to hold a small object, he reached with his left hand first, an instinctive reflex. This had no legal value, but it was a behavioral detail recorded in the file. The investigation team continued requesting medical history checks. Mr. A stated he hardly ever went to doctors, but a general exam revealed a mild deformity in the left wrist bone, a minor misalignment often formed in adolescence from an old injury. When cross-checked with the Lucas file, it was noted that the boy had fallen while climbing a tree in 1968, leading to his wrist being splinted for weeks. No one expected to find such a match. This was the 4th sign consistent with the 1969 missing child file. In the quick report sent to command, the forensic technician noted, immediate DNA testing required. Physical characteristic coincidence rate far exceeds random probability. To further strengthen, the investigation team analyzed Mr. A's movement corridor, the places he had lived over the decades. But he could not provide specific addresses. He only remembered living in many places, sometimes in other states, but not city names. This type of response forced the agency to rely even more on biological characteristics for identification. When asked about childhood, Mr. A only described fragmented memories. A house with red walls, a neighborhood with large trees, a small street with cars parked along both sides. These descriptions fit many New Jersey neighborhoods. But when matched to Barnett Street, where Lucas vanished, they became noteworthy. With no administrative or demographic data, no fingerprints in the system, and incomplete memories, DNA became the only tool that could determine Mr. A's true identity. The saliva DNA sample had already been collected earlier under NJSP procedure, but to ensure legal accuracy, technicians took an additional independent sample by swabbing both cheeks. This second sample was sealed separately and transported to the state forensic lab to rule out contamination or collection error. While waiting for DNA analysis, the investigation team continued checking other details. They used the estimated adult identification description from the 2003 scanned file and compared it to Mr. A's photos. Indicators like adult height, limb, length, ratio between skull and jaw all matched predictions from the 7-year-old child's file. Further dental data comparison, Mr. A had lost some teeth, but remaining ones showed a growth pattern shifted left, exactly matching the childhood dental record description for Lucas. Once again, not enough to conclude, but grounds showing the match probability rising. Before sending the DNA sample for official deep analysis, investigators asked Mr. A one final question. "Do you know where you were born?" He was silent, saying he didn't clearly remember the birthplace, and only recalled being cared for by someone when young, but not parents. This answer, though not evidence, further reinforced the suspicion that he might have been separated from family as a child. The final DNA sample was sealed in a standard preservation box, labeled with date, signed by 2 independent technicians, and transported to the New Jersey State Lab, where it would run STR analysis for direct comparison with the DNA extracted from Lucas's shirt in 2003. The investigators knew that if the results matched, this would be the biggest turning point in the case's history. If not, they would still have to determine who Mr. A was, an individual with no identity, no records, no past. But in the entire Lucas Barnett case, stretching over more than half a century, there had never been a moment when physical indicators, identifying features, and biological data all pointed to one common direction, like now. Every effort over 56 years now converged on a single test. DNA would answer the question no one had solved since 1969, and that sample, small, carefully sealed, was the key that would unlock the next phase of the investigation. The DNA sample was transported in a specialized preservation box to the New Jersey Forensic Laboratory under strict chain of custody procedures. There, 2 types of tests were conducted in parallel: STR testing to match against the shirt sample from 1969, and mitochondrial DNA, mPDNA testing to check for maternal lineage. Match, a method especially useful in long cold cases, where samples have degraded. The analysis process began with extracting DNA from the oral swab. The DNA spectrophotometer confirmed an abundant yield, sufficient for multiple independent comparisons. The analysis team ran qPCR to verify sample purity, ensuring no contaminants that could interfere. Everything met standards. When the initial STR segment was run, the technician proceeded to compare it against the DNA profile obtained from Lucas Barnett's shirt in 2003. The old DNA record was stored in the State Identification Database, SID, tagged with an internal code and previously marked incomplete but viable, meaning usable for comparison, though not an ideal complete sample. Over the years, no DNA sample had ever matched Lucas's profile. But this time, as the first alleles appeared on the screen, the technicians noticed something different. Mr. A sample matched every stored STR locus from the shirt sample. The initial match rate exceeded 99.99%. To be certain, the technician ran the full analysis a second time, using a remaining portion of the DNA sample. The result was identical. All 15 STR loci matched perfectly. No discrepancies, no differing alleles at any position. In forensics, this was virtually equivalent to confirmation. The 2 samples belonged to the same individual. The lead technician recorded in the log, full STR match observed, consistent with single individual identity. But to rule out extremely rare possibilities, such as identical twins or historical data errors, the laboratory proceeded with mtDNA analysis. Mitochondrial DNA is passed only through the maternal line, degrades less over time, and is particularly suitable for decades-old missing child cases, where it only needs comparison with old items or maternal relatives. The laboratory used mtDNA data stored in the Barnett family file, collected when the case was digitized in 2003, samples from the deceased mother, from a living maternal aunt, and from old medical records. When Mr. A mtDNA was analyzed, the result appeared the same day, a complete match with the maternal haplogroup of the Barnett family. A veteran forensic expert noted in the report, "The mtDNA profile is fully consistent with maternal lineage of the Barnett family." This was the first time in over half a century that scientific evidence identified an adult who could be connected to the Lucas Barnett case. STR proved individual identity. mtDNA proved maternal lineage identity. The 2 results combined created a near-absolute level of certainty. Immediately, the laboratory called NJSP directly, requesting an emergency meeting. When the results were presented, no one in the room spoke for several seconds. One investigator simply wrote a few words on the file. Positive identification. Lucas Barnett is alive. The information was forwarded to the Newark Police Department. The head of Newark's cold case unit immediately signed the order to reopen the Lucas Barnett file, the case frozen for 56 years. This was a significant legal action. When an unresolved file is reactivated, all original investigative documents are access locked, and only the special investigation team is permitted to review them. The system flagged the case as active identification recovered, an extremely rare classification in the U.S. criminology system. NPD sent notification to the prosecutor's office, attached with the dual-layer STR and mtDNA DNA report. The report concluded, identity confirmed. The unidentified male is Lucas Barnett, missing child from 1969. This meant the man living in Atlantic Highlands was not just an individual without identity, he was the 7-year-old boy who vanished from Newark in the summer of 1969. When Newark received the results, they immediately held a meeting with NJSP and DHS. The goal was to determine Mr. A's legal status, and more importantly, to determine what happened 56 years earlier. This was no longer a disappearance. This was the reappearance of a decades missing individual, a level of rarity almost unprecedented in New Jersey. However, confirming Mr. A, as Lucas did not answer any questions about the time from 1969 to 2020, he had no papers, no clear life history, no continuous memories. The only thing clear from the forensic data, he was Lucas Barnett. Investigators immediately conducted expanded biological data analysis to rule out any coincidence. A third time, the laboratory ran independent STR analysis on a different machine. A fourth time, they ran mtDNA analysis from a hair sample taken from Mr. A. All results were the same. 100% match with the Lucas file. This put an end to all scientific doubt. There was no longer any question about identity. The man who had lived in legal shadow for decades was the boy missing since 1969. As required by procedure, Newark reactivated the entire Lucas file. The 1969 neighborhood maps, witness lists, resident lists, statements, the names of the 4 men recorded that year, including Walter Green. For the first time in over half a century, old data and new data intersected. The investigation team knew that identity confirmation was only the beginning. The biggest question now was, where had Lucas been for 56 years? And who was responsible for his disappearance? Reopening the file also meant re-examining every name from the 1969 list, including Green, who died in 1999. Green could no longer be investigated, but his movements, the timing of his departure from Newark, and his appearance in 2 prior FBI reports would become the center of the next investigative phase. When the identity confirmation process was complete, a special report was sent to the New Jersey Department of Justice. The report concluded, this case is no longer classified as missing child unresolved. The missing individual has been located alive. This was the first official statement affirming that the 7-year-old boy once considered vanished without a trace had survived and grown up in mystery. But more importantly, the DNA results had turned the entire case upside down. It was no longer a question about a missing child. It was now the story of a man without a legal past for nearly 6 decades. Authorities had to begin tracing the time gaps, reconstructing Lucas's life journey from 1969 to 2020, and determining whether any criminal conduct was involved in severing the boy's identity. And it would all start from the one undeniable piece of data. Lucas Barnett, the child who vanished in 1969, was still alive. After the DNA results confirmed the identity, the New Jersey State Police immediately conducted the first formal interview with Mr. A, now legally identified as Lucas Barnett. The goal was not interrogation, but to gather any memories he had about the early years after the day he vanished. The session took place in a quiet interview room, with 2 investigators and a forensic psychologist experienced in handling fragmented memory cases. Lucas sat across from them, posture slightly hunched, eyes sometimes staring into empty space as if searching for faint images. When asked about his childhood, he closed his eyes for a few seconds and described what he remembered, not in sequence, not connected, but enough to change the atmosphere in the room. The first image he mentioned was a wooden cabin deep in a forest with thick tree canopy. He could not recall the geographic location, did not know which state, only described the cabin as always dark, with light coming through cracks in the wooden walls each morning and afternoon. Next to the cabin was a small clearing covered in rotting leaves, and farther away was a dirt road that only appeared when the weather was dry. He said he lived there for a very long time, but could not specify how long. His sense of time was completely broken. When the investigator asked who lived with him in the cabin, Lucas said there was an old man. The way he phrased it gave no clear age or detailed appearance. He only remembered that the man didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice was low, slow, sometimes sharp. Lucas did not remember his name, or perhaps never knew it, but he clearly recalled one thing. He told me not to go outside when it was light. This statement came up 3 times during the interview, showing it was a strong memory, yet still not clear enough to pinpoint specific behavior. The investigator shifted to why Lucas grew up without his real name. He replied that the old man called me by a different name, a simple one unrelated to Lucas or Barnett. When asked what it was, Mr. A answered, "That wasn't my real name. I knew it from when I was little." The name was repeated, but investigators noted that the way he pronounced it suggested it had been familiar to him for many years. Lucas said he did not remember when his name was changed, only that from the time I could talk, I had to use that name. This information did not form a clear narrative. No dates, no timelines, no locations. It was all just the opening fragments of a life separated from the world since 1969. The investigator asked next about what he did in the cabin. Lucas answered in pieces. "I slept on a small mattress. There was a low table. There was the smell of smoke, damp firewood." The recurring memory of light through the wooden planks led the forensic psychologist to conclude the cabin must have been deep in the forest, where sunlight was limited by thick canopy. When asked if he was allowed outside the cabin, he said only when it was completely dark. He described nights following the man to a stream where the water flowed very strongly. Without being prompted, he added, "I think that was the only place he let me go." The investigator began shifting to memories related to the trip away from Newark, but Lucas remembered no details about the journey. He only recalled being carried, then being in a closed space, possibly a vehicle, but he was not sure. He did not remember the duration, the distance, or the roads. That part of memory was completely blank. When asked about the feeling of growing up in the cabin, Lucas described that he did not know there were other people outside. No other children, no neighbors, no passers-by. He said his childhood took place in narrow rooms, with dim light. When the investigator asked about meals, he said the old man often brought food from somewhere, like canned meat, old bread, potatoes. There was no sign the cabin had a stable food source. However, a particularly important detail emerged when the investigator asked about changes in living places. Lucas replied that the cabin was not the only place he lived. He remembered another house, also in an isolated area with no surrounding homes. He recalled sleeping in a room with a small square window. The investigation team flagged this detail for the possibility of multiple locations involved in Lucas's journey after disappearance. As the interview delved deeper into memories, the lack of order became clear. Lucas remembered scattered images like old wooden doors, the strong flapping of bird wings, storms pounding the roof, the growl of an engine, the smell of machine oil, the smell of fire, the sound of the old man's footsteps moving at night. But he could not arrange them in chronological order. The images existed as memory shards, not connected by concepts of before or after. This led the investigation team to understand that Lucas's statements could not be used in a traditional way. These were not continuous memories, but forensic memory fragments, identifying fragments, but lacking temporal elements. To make use of them, they would have to reconstruct a forensic timeline, based on environmental descriptions, geographic features, climate conditions, cabin type, wood style, floor structure, door style, sounds, and light patterns. When the psychologist asked Lucas about the man who raised him, he only said the man was not family, and that he did not know where he got me from. This was not a confirmation, but an instinct. and instinct also has value in forensic psychology when assessing a child's perception of a caregiver. The first interview ended without any complete story, but there were key points: the cabin, the forest, an old man, 2 different locations, being given a new name, being restricted from going out during the day, memories of engine sounds, and no contact with anyone besides the old man. All of it began to form a picture, not a story, but a structure for the investigation team to start rebuilding Lucas's journey during the 56 years he was absent. And from here, the forensic timeline would become the only tool capable of arranging those fragmented memories into an orderly investigative direction. Right after the first interview with Lucas ended, the investigation team got to work on the most important task: identifying the location of the cabin in his fragmented memories. In decades-long disappearance cases, the forensic timeline always starts with location, the place most likely to hold physical traces that last longer than human memory. Based on the scant details Lucas described, light seeping through wooden cracks, not being allowed outside when it was light, a small clearing in front of the door, the strong sound of a nearby stream, and especially the later mention of another house, the task force hypothesized that Lucas had lived in multiple places, with the cabin being the first and longest. To find this cabin, the team focused on the only peripheral data of value: the name Walter Green, the man who appeared on the Newark resident list in 1969 and was also an individual present in 2 FBI reports related to other child disappearances. Though Lucas did not mention Green by name, the overlaps in behavior and timing made Green the person to check first. From Pennsylvania records, the investigation team confirmed Green had rented a wooden cabin in the forest near Stroudsburg in the early 1970s. The location was noted in old Monroe County land rental records, where small structures like cabins were occasionally listed for tax purposes. The cabin had been abandoned for years after Green left, and the landowner died. Upon receiving confirmation from the Land Records Office, the team immediately coordinated with Pennsylvania State Police to access the area. They had to cross a long, muddy dirt road after the previous night's rain. Ancient trees blocked the light, creating a damp chill even in the middle of the day. This very landscape made many investigators recall Lucas's descriptions: light through wooden cracks, darkness persisting even during the day. And when the cabin appeared in a thinned-out section of forest, a gray, weathered wooden structure leaning slightly to one side, the whole team understood this was very likely where Lucas's fragmented memories began. The cabin was small, less than 3 meters wide and about 4 meters long. The walls were worn wood, many sections rotted from time and weather. The front door hung ajar, hinges so rusted that even a light touch produced a creaking sound. When the team broke the old seal and opened the door, no one spoke. Inside, though thick with dust, the room layout still showed signs of prolonged habitation. A small bed was placed against the left corner of the cabin, low wooden frame, size suitable for a child from 5 to 10 years old. The mattress was torn and decayed but still recognizable in shape. A low wooden table, exactly as Lucas described, sat against the right wall. Dust on the tabletop was so thick that a square indentation was visible where a heavy object had sat for a long time. One corner of the cabin had a small wood stove, roughly built from bricks and stones gathered from the forest, still holding ash, charcoal, and black soot stains on the wall above. As investigators conducted a thorough survey, they discovered signs the cabin had been used regularly. Old pieces of binding cord, rusted canned goods, glass jar lids, and especially a few small items like a child-sized metal spoon and a scrap of fabric with simple patterns both unsuitable for an adult living alone. Under the bed frame, the team found several wooden sticks roughly carved into shapes, like handmade toys or objects used to pass the time. These findings strongly reinforced the conclusion that the cabin had been used as a residence for a child, and not just for a few days, but over an extended period. Beyond the cabin, investigators checked the surrounding area to cross-reference Lucas's statements. Less than 20 meters behind the cabin, they discovered a large stream flowing swiftly due to the steep terrain. The sound of water crashing against rocks echoed constantly, exactly as Lucas described, loud enough to drown out all surrounding noise. This matched the detail of being taken to the stream when it was dark. At the bottom of the small slope leading to the stream, investigators noticed a faint trail, faded over time, but still enough to confirm someone had walked it repeatedly. This aligned with Lucas's memories of nights leaving the cabin to follow the old man. Inside the cabin, investigators found no personal papers, but did find a 1971 kitchen catalog, a few old book pages, and an empty tin box. Some items suggested the cabin was used not just briefly but possibly for many years. The walls had several long scratches, looking like marks a child might make while waiting or trying to count days, but because the cabin was old and damaged, forensics could not precisely date when they were made. With all the collected data, the cabin was classified as a primary-secondary scene, meaning the most important secondary crime scene in the case, similar to a primary scene but not the initial incident location. This cabin was likely where Lucas lived in the early period after disappearing, and where the old man strongly suspected to be Walter Green kept him for a long time. A mobile laboratory was set up right outside the cabin to collect every sample that might still hold forensic value. Pried wood fragments, hair caught in bedboards, fabric fibers stuck in wall cracks, ash residue in the stove, and even soil from under the bed. Though the cabin was over half a century old, forensics knew some organic materials could persist for a very long time in an undisturbed environment. They found a few hairs under the rotted mattress. It was unclear if they belonged to Lucas, Green, or someone else, but they were sent for analysis. They also found faint shoe impressions on a wooden beam near the door, smaller than adult shoe size. Though the timing could not be confirmed, it was one of the strongest signs that a child had lived in the cabin. Once the cabin was fully documented, the investigation team created a detailed map, photographed every angle, remeasured the entire area, and built a 3D model to reconstruct the forensic timeline. The cabin was not just a physical structure. It became the first anchor point to fit Lucas's memories into a real environment. From the cabin's location, the team could begin estimating the old man's next movement direction, possible locations of the second house, and the escape route Green might have used when leaving Newark. The cabin did not answer why Lucas disappeared, but it did answer where he had been in the initial period after leaving New Jersey. And this was the most important piece to expand the severed journey that lasted 56 years, a journey the investigation team now had a specific starting point to follow. Right after the cabin was classified as the primary-secondary scene, the investigation team shifted focus to the only individual with historical data matching both Newark in 1969 and the Pennsylvania area where the cabin was found, Walter Green. The fact that the cabin was located exactly in the area Green had rented in the early 1970s made any random coincidence hard to believe. To understand Green's role clearly, the team reopened all resident records, tax files, rental records, and even postal documents related to him from previous decades, a process that took many weeks but was an unavoidable step. The first record revealed an important fact. Green had lost his son in 1968, just 1 year before Lucas vanished. Bangor County Hospital records in Pennsylvania noted that he had a 5-year-old son who died from complications following pneumonia. Contemporary social reports stated clearly, after the child's death, Green fell into severe depression, limited interaction with others, quit his job suddenly, and lived reclusively for many months. Even a note from the local health office described Green as showing signs of mild paranoia and defensive behavior towards strangers. This was the first time the investigation team had clear data showing Green might have suffered a serious psychological shock right before the period when Lucas disappeared. But the most striking data came from a detail in New Jersey tax records. Green left Newark right after the summer of 1969, exactly coinciding with Lucas's disappearance. Green's only confirmed address in Newark was just a few blocks from Barnett Street. In the records, Green had no friends, no relatives living nearby, and left no indication of why he came to Newark. His sudden departure, without notifying the landlord, without leaving a forwarding address, and with no clear means of transportation, led the team to note the timing of his Newark exit as highly suspicious in the 2025 report. To build Green's movement timeline, the investigation team reconstructed his life journey from 1968 until his death in 1999. This was a difficult task because Green lived evasively with little social interaction and almost no administrative traces. However, based on rental records, utility bills, and scattered land registry documents, the team assembled relatively consistent time markers. 1968. Pennsylvania. Green lost his son and moved to live alone in a small town near Stroudsburg. Records show he lived in a cheap rented room, unstably. 1969, Newark, New Jersey. Green appeared at an address near Barnett Street. Records note he rented a room in a subdivided house. Estimated stay from early 1969 to midsummer. This is the period when Lucas vanished. 1970 to 1972, Pennsylvania, Stroudsburg area. Green returned to the Monroe County Forest region and rented the cabin, the exact cabin found in the previous investigation phase. Local land tax records list his name among individuals using the cabin as temporary residence. This time frame matches Lucas's description of living in a forest cabin with an old man. 1973 to 1976, unknown location. Green disappeared from local records during this period. The investigation team found only one document, a mail receipt sent to an Ohio address under the name Green, but could not verify if it was the same person. 1977 to 1983, Pennsylvania. Green reappeared in rental records, this time in an old wooden house on the edge of another forest, about 40 kilometers from the first cabin. This aligns with Lucas's description of another house after the initial cabin. 1984 to 1990, sporadic records. Green rented rooms in cheap motels, living nomadically but rarely changing regions. A few bills show he did odd jobs for landowners, but no community interaction recorded. 1991 to 1999. Pennsylvania. Green lived alone in a small house near an old highway. Hospital records note he was admitted twice for heart issues before dying in 1999. The entire timeline revealed a clear behavioral pattern: isolated life, movement within a small radius around Pennsylvania forests, avoidance of social contact, and especially presence in both Newark and Stroudsburg during key periods of the disappearance. This data could not confirm Green took Lucas, but it showed Green as the only individual whose path matched the movement and concealment of a child over many years. Investigators continued examining documents about the second cabin, the wooden house Lucas described. Land rental records showed Green signed a document for the sale of a structure in 1978, related to a small house on private land. This opened the possibility that the old man moved Lucas between multiple locations to avoid detection, a behavior seen in some federal criminal patterns. A 1983 hospital record noted Green suffered from mild social paranoia and limited communication. Forensic psychologists assessed Green as likely fitting the substitute child behavior profile, where an individual who lost a child tends to compensate by controlling another child. Though everything remained at the model level, without direct evidence, the connection between Lucas's memories and Green's timeline grew clearer. The cabin Lucas described matched the one Green rented. The second house Lucas remembered matched the wooden house Green lived in from 1977 to 1983. Green leaving Newark the same year Lucas vanished was a coincidence too significant to ignore, and his loss of a son right before 1969 opened a psychological possibility. He sought to replace the loss by taking Lucas, keeping him in isolated conditions. All these factors made Green, even though deceased since 1999, the focal point of the forensic timeline. This was not just reconstructing the file of a mysterious man. It was tracing the path of Lucas Barnett's life severed from the world for 56 years. And Green, though no longer alive to answer any questions, remained the most important anchor point to continue expanding the investigation. Once the entire timeline of Walter Green was constructed, the behavioral analysis team began evaluating the profile according to the standards of the National Behavioral Analysis Institute, NABIS. The scattered data on Green losing his son in 1968, moving to Newark without clear purpose, leaving the city at the exact time Lucas vanished, living in isolation in the Pennsylvania forests, residing for years in a cabin with traces of child habitation, all formed a pattern that forensic psychology calls substitute child abductor. This is a rare offender group, not motivated by sexual, financial, or violent purposes, but by replacing a lost child with another. often through opportunistic kidnapping. Green fit this model significantly. The psychological shock of losing his son may have driven him into a state needing to recreate the caregiving role, but in a distorted, reclusive, and completely controlling way. Hospital records from 1968 to 1969 noted Green showing signs of social withdrawal, obsessive protective behavior toward items related to his deceased son, and mild paranoia when interacting with strangers. These are common indicators in the substitute child abductor group. Mental instability following a traumatic event, leading to child abduction but without harm to life. The most notable match was the absence of any evidence of violence at the cabin. No signs of restraints, no weapons, no indications of assault. The cabin was rudimentary but not a violent detention site. It resembled a minimalist, enclosed living space, deprived but without traces of torture or injury-causing behavior. This aligned with the behavioral model of the substitute child abductor group, keeping the child as a replacement but not directly harming them. Isolation, restrictions on going outside, and avoidance of social contact were control methods, not physical abuse. Lucas described that he was not allowed outside when it was light, which matched the behavior pattern of those wanting to prevent the child from being discovered. A cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest residential area, with a fast-flowing stream behind the house, all fit the long-term concealment strategy. Long-term concealment. This is the second model in forensic classification. Kidnapping, long-term concealment. In many criminology documents, this type often appears in individuals living in isolation, with attachment disorders following trauma, and developing a dependent relationship with the abducted child. Green matched nearly all categories. There was no rapid movement or fleeing after the abduction. Instead, he settled in a fixed area, the Pennsylvania forests, for many years. This was confirmed by cabin rental records, prolonged habitation traces, and a decades-long residency timeline in remote areas. Environmental analysis of the cabin showed long-term existence. A wood stove used for many years, a low table suitable for a small child, a child-sized bed, and items bearing marks of extended time. Green did not try to hide the cabin. It was isolated only due to its remote geographic location, not built with sophisticated criminal concealment in mind. This is common in the substitute child abductor model. They do not believe they are committing a crime in the legal sense. In their distorted psychology, they believe the child belongs to them. Forensic psychology noted a characteristic behavior. Name change. Lucas clearly described being called by a different name from when he was little, and that he knew it was not his real name. This aligned perfectly with the substitute child abductor model. They often change the child's name to sever ties to the past and create a new bond under the parent-child role. Combined with Green's loss of his son in 1968, this created a clear behavioral structure. Green did not abduct to harm Lucas. He abducted to replace a lost role and maintained that role through prolonged isolation. Particularly important was the absence of any evidence that Lucas ever left Green during the period from 1969 to at least the late 1970s. The first cabin, then the second wooden house, both fell within Green's residency timeline. Lucas remembered two different structures matching the two places Green had lived. From this, the forensic model built a stable structure. Green took Lucas from Newark to Pennsylvania, raised him in the first cabin for several years, then moved to the second wooden house, and continued isolated living until at least 1983. The 1983 hospital file showed Green beginning to have health issues, limiting long-distance movement. This could explain Lucas growing up in deprived conditions but not being abandoned. Green may have become dependent on Lucas for daily activities, a common feature in substitute child abductor cases as the offender ages. After Green's death in 1999, the forensic timeline is currently unclear on how Lucas lived. This is the part requiring further investigation. But the key in the behavioral model, all matching data pointed to one single crime type: kidnapping, long-term concealment without violence, without assault, but with prolonged possession, and hiding based on psychological need. When the behavioral model report was completed, the investigation team concluded that Green did not fit any abduction, assault, violence, crime type, nor trafficking models, but fit almost perfectly the profile of an abductor replacing a lost child, substitute child abductor. This was not a legal conclusion, since Green was deceased, but a critical behavioral finding, paving the way for reconstructing Lucas's journey from the first cabin to adulthood and determining if any other individuals were involved after Green's death. Those questions would lead the investigation into the next phase. Once the behavioral model was completed, the Joint Federal-State Task Force moved to the final step: legal evaluation. This phase not only examined forensic data, but also cross-referenced it against evidentiary standards under New Jersey and federal law. The goal was not retrial, but to issue an official conclusion for a case spanning more than half a century. The compiled report consisted of 3 data groups. 1. Physical evidence from the cabin and DNA samples. 2. Forensic timeline based on Green's movements. 3. Lucas's verified statements and fragmented memories. When placed side by side, these 3 groups formed a chain of causation strong enough to identify the perpetrator under the legal standard known as preponderance of evidence in cases beyond statute of limitations or where the subject is deceased. First was the timeline evidence. Green appeared in Newark during the exact period Lucas vanished. The cabin Green rented in Pennsylvania contained a child-sized bed, items suitable for Lucas's age, and traces of prolonged habitation. No other individual was ever recorded living in the cabin. The area was too remote for casual residency. Environmental forensics showed consistent use of the cabin over many years, matching Lucas's memories of long-term isolation. Next was the behavioral data. Green had just lost his son in 1968, satisfying one of the primary motive factors in the substitute child abductor model. Hospital records proved he fell into psychological instability, withdrawal, and difficulty integrating socially. Combined with the movement pattern leaving Newark at the exact time, appearing in Stroudsburg shortly after, and remaining in the Pennsylvania forest region for nearly the rest of his life. Green's behavior aligned completely with the model of abducting a child and raising him in isolation. Third was the direct data from Lucas. He remembered the cabin, remembered an old man, remembered being given a new name, remembered interior spaces matching the cabin's structure, and remembered a second wooden house, similar to the one Green lived in from 1977 to 1983. Lucas described no violent behavior. This matched the established forensic model. The memories were incomplete, but corroborated by actual physical evidence at the scene. Legally, this is called memory corroboration. Memory is not evidence, but it becomes verified by on-site traces. Finally, and most importantly, was the DNA data. STR-DNA and mtDNA. The DNA absolutely confirmed that the man living in Atlantic Highlands was Lucas Barnett. This eliminated any hypothesis of another subject and locked the connection between Lucas and the locations Green had lived. After 6 weeks of interagency meetings, the New Jersey State Police Legal Unit, representatives from the prosecutor's office, the forensic lab, and federal investigators reached a conclusion. Walter Green was the sole perpetrator in the abduction of Lucas Barnett in 1969. Green took Lucas from Newark to Pennsylvania, kept him in the forest cabin for many years, moved to the second wooden house as the boy grew older, and maintained isolation into the 1980s. When Green died in 1999, the forensic timeline was still unclear on how Lucas left the isolated environment. But at the legal stage, this did not affect criminal responsibility for the initial act. In missing person cases, the legal standard for offender attribution does not require the evidentiary level of a criminal trial, especially when the subject is deceased. New Jersey law allows an official written conclusion if a strong causal link exists, no second subject fits the timeline, and no counter-evidence exists. All 3 conditions were met. There was no trace of an accomplice. No data proving Lucas was ever cared for by anyone other than Green. No signs Lucas was sold, transferred, or entered any other system. Green was the sole connecting line between Newark 1969 and Pennsylvania 1970 to 1990. The New Jersey prosecutor's office issued the decision. Walter Green, deceased, is identified as the sole individual responsible for the abduction and long-term concealment of Lucas Barnett, commencing June 1969. Case closed. This decision carried no prosecutorial weight, since Green died in 1999, but it carried legal confirmation. No criminal case was opened, no trial, no charging procedure. But legally, the Lucas Barnett disappearance was officially resolved. In the final paragraph of the concluding document, there was one sentence the entire investigation team paused over when reading. Lucas Barnett, missing child of Newark, was alive for 56 years outside all known systems. The case is resolved, though the circumstances of his later life remain under separate investigation. With that sentence, the case was closed, revealing the full truth about the origin of the disappearance journey, but leaving the door open for unanswered questions. How did Lucas live after Green died? Who saw him first? And how did he exist outside all administrative records for decades? The 1969 disappearance, lasting 56 years, finally had a clear legal conclusion. Green was the sole perpetrator. After the legal conclusion document was signed and approved, a case review hearing, a file review session, was held at the New Jersey State Police headquarters. This is the standard procedure for historical cases resolved through new technology, spanning many decades and impacting the state's civil administrative records. Attendees included representatives from the prosecutor's office, the cold case investigation team, forensic experts, behavioral specialists, and 3 representatives from the Newark Police Department, the agency where the case originated in 1969. The meeting began with a forensic summary. The forensic expert presented in logical order, emphasizing the 4 pillars of the entire findings. 1. Dual-layer DNA comparison. The STR-DNA results between the sample taken from Mr. A and the sample extracted from the shirt in 2003 were an absolute match. mtDNA matched completely with the maternal line of the Barnett family. The forensic report concluded Mr. A. identity as Lucas Barnett beyond any scientific uncertainty. 2. Walter Green's movement timeline. The behavioral specialist presented Green's reconstructed life through tax records, rental records, land documents, medical notes, and local data. Appeared in Newark at the exact time Lucas went missing. Left Newark immediately after the incident. Resided in the Pennsylvania forest area from 1970 to 1972. Lived in the second wooden house, matching Lucas's description, from 1977 to 1983. Continued isolated living in remote areas until his death in 1999. No other individual in resident records had a more matching timeline than Green. 3. The cabin, primary-secondary scene. Pennsylvania investigators reported the discovered cabin contained full traces: child-sized bed, low table, small items sized for a child, canned goods, prolonged habitation items, trail leading down to the stream, matching Lucas's statements perfectly. Hair and fabric samples collected are undergoing deeper analysis, but the cabin already qualified as a primary-secondary scene. 4. Behavioral model. The NABIS expert confirmed Green's behavior fit the substitute child abductor model and the crime type kidnapping, long-term concealment. No evidence of violence, no sexual or financial motive. The behavior stemmed from the trauma of losing his child and led to abduction concealment over an extended period, building an isolated living environment like the cabin. When the 4 pillars were presented, no one in the room raised counter questions. Supporting analyses, including Lucas's fragmented memories corroborated by the cabin scene, and consistency between the forensic timeline and statements, had been detailed in prior internal reports, requiring no further elaboration. The next part of the review was legal evaluation. The prosecutor's office representative reaffirmed that no second suspect existed. No evidence pointed to any other individual involved in detaining or controlling Lucas. Green was the sole connecting line between Newark disappearance point and Pennsylvania multi-year residence point. Since Green was deceased, prosecution procedures could not proceed, but legal responsibility conclusion was still confirmed under standards for resolving non-prosecutable cases. A document was projected on the large screen, the compiled forensic timeline map, linking Newark, 1969, Pennsylvania. Cabin, 1970. Wooden house, 1977. Green's death location, 1999. A straight timeline, no breaks, no signs of another individual. When the DNA data was displayed as the final piece closing the entire journey, the meeting moved to the official announcement. The Newark cold case team leader read the statement. The Lucas Barnett disappearance case, opened in 1969, is officially classified Solve. Sole perpetrator, Walter Green. Deceased. No secondary subjects. File closed. After the statement, the case review minutes were entered into the federal system to set precedent and reference for other long-term child disappearance cases. All meeting participants recognized the significance of this case, not just identifying one man's identity, but establishing an effective interagency forensic process for decades-old disappearances. The hearing concluded with the decision to transfer the file to the Civil Investigation Unit to continue determining Lucas's journey in the years after Green's death. After the Lucas Barnett case was officially classified as solved, its impact did not stop at the case review meeting room. For many decades, missing child cold cases in New Jersey were handled in a fragmented model. Local police collected information. The state cross-checked, and federal involvement only occurred when there was suspicion of crossing state lines. The Lucas case, with results only emerging after 56 years thanks to an administrative coincidence, dual-layer DNA technology, and interagency data connection, became the clearest proof that the old model was insufficient for long-term disappearances. Right in the month following the case review hearing, the New Jersey State Police issued a cold case procedure revision, with the first fundamental change. Every child disappearance lasting over 10 years would automatically be entered into a three-way connection system between SSA, FBI, state police, instead of just passive storage. This was exactly the gap that had kept the Lucas file dormant for decades. If this system had existed since the 1990s, an individual applying for reissued identity without background data like Mr. A would have been flagged much earlier. The second change was the mandatory requirement to collect DNA from the victim's personal items in every child disappearance, regardless of whether there was a crime scene. Lucas's shirt, once considered unimportant evidence, turned out to be the starting point for the case's biggest breakthrough. Standardizing DNA collection from missing children's items helped New Jersey lead many states in preparing data for cases that could stretch across decades. The third change involved forensic mapping. From the Lucas case, investigators recognized the importance of reconstructing historical terrain. Newark in the 1960s was far different from Newark today, and without the 1969 resident maps, the team could not have rebuilt the movement route and the probability disappearance zone. Therefore, New Jersey launched the Historical Geo-Archive Project, digitizing resident maps, transportation systems, housing density, and infrastructure for each decade. This data enabled forensic geography, a field once undervalued, to become a pillar in cold cases. But the most important change was the federal data connection model. The Lucas case showed that only when SSA, DHS, FBI, and state police shared data in real time could a no-record adult file be flagged properly. From there, New Jersey signed a pilot program with the FBI. Any individual living in the state without civil records for 30 years would have their identity checked against missing child and unidentified remains systems. This was a major advance in identity management technology and one of the direct lessons from the Lucas case, a man who had existed outside all systems for over 50 years. At the New Jersey Investigation Academy, the Lucas Barnett case quickly became part of the official curriculum. Not because of its strangeness or sensationalism, but because the case was a rare illustration showing a disappearance could be solved after half a century. Fragmented memories still hold forensic value if corroborated by the scene. A forest cabin, residency timeline, and DNA could completely intersect to retell a story severed for too long. Forensic psychology instructors used the Green file as a typical example of substitute child abductor, a rare but clearly existing psychological model in criminology. In forensic mapping classes, the cabin where Lucas lived became an illustration of how a secondary scene, even damaged by time, could still play a decisive role. Though the case was closed, its long-term consequences continued to spread. Many other counties in New Jersey began reviewing old forest cabins, abandoned houses, and unregistered private land. These reviews were not to find traces of Lucas, but to search for signs overlooked in other disappearances. From Atlantic Highlands to the Warren County Forest region, small investigation teams began looking for indicators related to other missing child files from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. At the national level, the FBI used the Lucas case as a model document in cold case identity reconstruction training, emphasizing the most important factor. A missing person is not always dead. Sometimes they simply vanish from the system, and in those cases, the investigator's task is not just to find a body but to find an identity. When the final report was entered into the system, one additional note was added, a line many investigators saw as the biggest lesson. Lucas Barnett was found not by searching for him, but by searching through the system that failed to see him. The case was closed. But New Jersey's investigative procedures were opened in a completely new way. The story of Lucas Barnett is not just the journey of decoding a 56-year disappearance, but also a profound reflection of systemic issues that America today still faces. From Lucas's file vanishing from every database for half a century, to an adult man like Lucas living without anyone knowing he existed, the story raises questions about community responsibility, connections between federal-state agencies, and the importance of keeping children safe in a vast, complex society. The first lesson comes from what seemed like a minor detail. The shirt Lucas wore on the day he vanished, the only item collected in 1969. Decades later, that very shirt became the bridge to confirm identity, reminding Americans that sometimes things thought meaningless can hold life-saving value when technology advances. The second lesson stems from systemic failure. For over 50 years, no agency realized that Lucas under a new identity did not exist in any government record. This reflects a real issue in America. Fragmentation between federal databases makes it easy for many people to fall through the cracks, including abuse victims, homeless, elderly, even missing children not fully reported. And above all, the story of the forest cabin where Lucas spent his entire childhood reminds Americans that isolation can happen right in the heart of the most developed nation in the world. Sometimes what is needed is not just surveillance technology or improved data, but community vigilance. Noticing unusual changes, helping those living on society's margins, and maintaining concern for cases thought too old to solve. The Lucas Barnett case shows that any life, no matter how faint for decades, deserves to be seen, known, and reconnected to the world. If you find the 56-year journey to recover, Lucas Barnett's identity brings important perspectives on community safety and justice. Please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next real investigation stories. Thank you for joining, and see you in the next video, where we continue decoding cases thought to have no answers forever.